Thank you for joining us for this next episode of Beyond Allyship, a series from Green Card Voices focused on engaging with different immigrant and cultural communities around ways we can stand in better solidarity with our Black community. I'm Asha Tanki, podcast manager at Green Card Voices and a Gujarati American writer working at the intersections of gender, queerness, caste, and class.
And I'm Tree, or Tri, social media and marketing manager at Green Card Voices, as well as the host of the Green Card Voices podcast series titled Love Your Asian Neighbors. This week, we're releasing part 1 of a 2-part conversation with Darian Spearman and Lily Luo, both doctoral candidates at the University of Connecticut. Keep an eye out for part 2 in the coming months.
Darian Spearman is a PhD candidate at the University of Connecticut. He specializes in Africana philosophy, philosophy of myth, philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, and philosophy of education. Though he currently lives in Willimantic, Connecticut, Darian has roots in Chicago, Seattle, San Diego, and Carbondale, Illinois.
Lily Luo is a scholar, poet, and visual artist who loves engaging with the thoughts and spirituality of queer women of color. Lily's art and scholarship revolves around queer love, intersectional justice, and Asian American identity. She was previously working as a faith-based community organizer before joining the political science department at the University of Connecticut. In her spare time, Lily loves to garden, bake, and dance with friends. Her spirit goddesses are Audre Lorde, Gloria E. Anzaldúa, and Grace Lee Boggs. You can find Lily's work on her blog, theyellowlilyblog.wordpress.com.
So my name is Lily. I go by she, her pronouns. Why Asian Black solidarity is important to me. I've taken a lot of inspiration both as an activist, community organizer, and academic from Black artists, thinkers, and history, and specifically in the US context. That's sort of a more movement-based answer. I think a more personal answer too, which is very interconnected, is that specifically I would say Black female writers like Audre Lorde or Bell Hooks or singers like Billie Holiday or Nina Simone. After reading their work, I think it gave me permission to feel and to create new understandings of my own identity as well. Their ability to speak on their own experiences and the beauty that comes from their art and their work not only have inspired me, but I feel like have created really fruitful grounds for a lot of different communities and specifically other women of color to just live and to love and to find joy. And so I'm very grateful to that lineage. And I think that taking inspiration, having gratitude also necessarily means being in solidarity and being alongside the struggle and not just taking the work and the joy, but also being alongside different communities for the struggle as well.
So I'm Darian. I use he, him pronouns. I'm here because Professor Fredley asked me to come. No, I'm kidding. I'm here because I'm interested in how America and the world, but right now America is going to transform itself. And I don't see how that's going to occur without some types of new forms of alliances between groups of people. And I hope that it maybe even will turn to new forms of identification between groups of people, right? I mean, identification has been a big part of how movements have functioned around the world, but in the US in particular. And maybe that's a bad idea, but I think that new forms of identification are a big part of it. And I see these discussions as building bridges towards these maybe different kinds of identity, which we'll talk about. Some of them people don't like people of color, but that didn't exist before. And people treat it as a form of identification. And it does do work. It's one of the reasons why we're in this space together, right? But there might be new and different ones that might need to emerge, or new or old ones.
With those basics out of the way, we can go into this more freely flowing conversation that starts with the article that I shared with the group on Letters for Black Lives. It was written by a writer over at the podcast and newsletter Time to Say Goodbye, written by Andy Liu, this phenomenon of young Asian children of immigrants and refugee parents about anti-Black racism and what it means for these letters to exist and what their aims are. People have been talking about how movements, the uprisings have kind of lulled in the past month. The initial spark that caused momentum have not dissipate, but definitely slowed. And there are questions of what does it look like to sustain this energy and sustain the demands that for things like police abolition or defunding police
Something that comes immediately to mind for me is the way that we sustain these movements by finding continued moments of action. A lot of folks in my circles have been really activated by the recent asylum case and finding ways to discuss what it means for a Sri Lankan fleeing conflict to have been, to have appealed his case and then been denied asylum, and for that to mean that folks can no longer really appeal their cases, that the Supreme Court has taken that away, connects for a lot of my circles with the question of, borders, the state of the police and prison, the role of ICE, and all of that, again, connects back to, I think, that origin of the movement for Black liberation. I think finding these continued moments of, what we see as one political moment here is always connected to the next political moment, so that they don't stand isolated, but that we see those threads throughout them. I think that has helped keep, fervor from dissipating within my circles, continuing to make those connections between different ongoing battles and seeing how, we're fighting towards a very similar aspirational future on many fronts.
That's a really interesting thought to start us with, Tree. When you mentioned that, I was thinking about, so this past week, I was facilitating a racial justice summer camp for some youth of the Episcopal Church of Massachusetts, mouthful. And it was really interesting because one of the things that we were, the organizer who was teaching them about racial justice work, and specifically racial justice work led by Black and Brown youth in Massachusetts from this organization called I Have a Future. She was saying that there's a lot of myths associated with organizing work or movement work. And one of the myths is this, there's two myths. One is a really charismatic leader myth, and the other one is spontaneous combustion. And basically what she was talking about was a lot of people see figureheads of movements and believe that the movement is led from there and all the ideas come from there. And a lot of people see these big explosions or moments, so to speak, and believe that that is the movement. And I think she obviously was speaking from a community organizing perspective and someone who does this all the days of the years. And she was saying, like, people don't see the work and the organization that happens to make those moments, possible. So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about, there is this feeling of urgency and a feeling of exceptionalism to the moment we're in. And I think that is true. But I think what is also true is that many people have been invested in these issues for a long time. And I've been thinking about how do we not just go from moment to moment, but find sustainable, joyful ways of revolting, of pushing, of creating new ways that actually don't always put us in this, we need to get to the next moment. Whereas I'm thinking about like sustainable, joyful ways of creating new relationships with one another. I think conversations like this are one aspect of it. And I feel like in those instances, the more local things are, the more it can be knit into our lives in a long-term way.
Yeah, these are great things that you guys said. I just want to add that crisis management is one of the major governing styles of the current regime. And I mean that in terms of how things are institutionalized. And so a lot of us have witnessed and participated in a lot of crisis management, and we tend to not, our society tends not to respond to things until they become a crisis. And then it's not trying to solve it, but manage it. And this is why I have a friend who talks about how a lot of people from business are going to politics, and because managing things is now what we try to do. And I think that, like what Lily was saying, that there is this kind of need to build communities or structures that can receive the energies of these moments. If you think of like water or something like that, right? It's something that can be held or contained and used for various purposes. But if it's just like, if you just build a structure to match just, oh man, all this energy is manifesting, we have to capture it and use it, well, then it's going to dissipate pretty quickly. And I think that also we have to be real about how systemic and sustained the efforts of the US government and other nations to destroy these communities and destroy organizing work and destroy things that have been built. So we don't have as good of a foundation for so many things as we might. And so we are very much in a process of foundation building, which is great in a lot of ways, but it means that realistically, some of the crises we may not be able to respond to that well or at all if we're also building foundations for movements in the future. That's one. And then to what Asha was saying, I think that there has, in terms of like infrastructure, there has to be something involving information because, for example, this asylum case, I had no idea about it, right? And for Asha, she was saying like this for her is a manifestation of how the energy of George Floyd is continuing in her circle is into this asylum case. I had no idea about it. There is a process that can, it's an opportunity. There's a process by which we can kind of share information. And I could learn why this case is important and what it means. And it could be something that maybe over time could be something that people could respond to from different communities. Because realistically, I do see that a lot of people in communities I know, if I mention this case, unless I explain it very well to a lot of them why they should care, they're not going to be like, yeah, I'm on, like I'm going to be involved. There's also kind of information, education type structure.
Kind of thinking, Darian, about what you were saying, I'm thinking about information spreading though, and I'm thinking about, those Instagram posts that have been kind of a lot of folks' way of, participating in the movement for Black liberation, but, to whatever performative degree or actual degree is always up in the air for question. But what I'm really thinking about is also, the sharing of information that happens now across social media. And I'm actually thinking back to your original question about those letters and how those letters have become in many ways these Instagram posts that people share on their feed, right? It's one thing to be writing the letter to your grandparents or, your extended community, but those letters are now also the same thing that's appearing on people's Instagram feeds as this like gauge of, okay, friend, if you haven't seen this, like this is my way of giving more information to you. I guess I'm just making that connection in terms of, there are the letters which are perennial, which like have been in existence since, in my mind, like the early 2010s, but I'm sure it's even before that. I think that's when they came across my radar, and just thinking about, that question of, there's so many posts that are like, hey, has your feed returned back to normal? How do you keep energy going? And also whether that's a question kind of to speak to back to what Lily said, is that just a question of like moment to moment, like how does that get sustained in people's actual actions in their daily life beyond just like that performative Insta story post? But I guess that's just where my mind goes first, thinking about what both of y'all have said.
Yeah, I think what the thing interesting about the letters is in the article is that the author, she links them to kind of a liberal white-centered project. And so there is a strong question to be asked about what purpose do those letters actually serve, right? It seems like it's very much a kind of moral issue, right? In the sense of like, it's wrong that you have this, it's wrong that you use darky toothpaste, but you don't understand. But there's nothing that really contributes to a concrete movement or bridging the gap, right? This is also because, for example, this space, those letters seem like they're intra-community, and this space is already trying to be in between communities, right? Intra-communities. And so, for example, there's no project of like sharing these letters or with Black people. That's just one example of like, but maybe because it's not actually that effective a community, but maybe it is to share these letters with these people. I don't know. But it does seem like it's very much about like establishing to yourself and others that you have a certain kind of racial consciousness, and perhaps maybe a naive belief that educating your grandparents or your parents is going to make them have a different political orientation towards the world. That's kind of how I felt about what you said.
I think just to go off of what both of you were saying, where is the relationship building in those letters, and where is the internal work, like internal movement work? I do think letters like that can be a helpful part of a larger toolbox. Translating certain words into Korean or into Mandarin or into any other language could be useful. Our relatives might be more open to having these conversations if we're able to have them in a language where they feel more secure in, and they don't feel like you're talking down to them using English words that they're not familiar with. Part of the issue, and this kind of goes into the performative part of what we're noting is that, is it simply a matter of copy pasting the same letter and then translating it into multiple cultural contexts, and not just cultural context, but family context? My relationship to my parents is going to be pretty different in many significant ways than maybe other Chinese Americans' relationship to their parents. There might be similarities, but I think part of the work is also honoring difference. And so I think about like how much community and relationship building are these acts of sharing on Instagram? Does it instigate conversation? Do you then use those conversations to build deeper relationship? And what Darian was saying too, or Asha, I forgot who said this, but it was like, is this a matter of simply needing to correct your incorrect relatives, or I have the right racial consciousness and they have the wrong one, and this letter is a way to correct that? Because if that's the intention, that kind of does bring in that whole, like, are we trying to go towards a white liberal framework of racial justice? Or rather, is it an invitation for further relationship and conversation? Are we allowing room for the fact that once you start these conversations about race and identity and culture, you may learn just as much from your relatives as they're going to learn from you? Certainly my personal experience has been when I've opened these conversations with my parents in good faith, I've learned a lot from them, and some of what I've learned from them are uncomfortable because they don't fit into a necessarily quote unquote liberal framework that I've been taught in university or speak to with my friends who are university educated in that manner. And what do I do when their stories don't exactly fit into that framework? Do I just shut it aside, or do I actually try to expand my own imagination to realize that while frameworks for going towards racial justice are helpful, when our own lives and cultures don't fit into it, we shouldn't try to just, violently fit it into that. We should actually try to reimagine and expand those frameworks.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you're saying, Lily, and I just remember this Google Doc that I want to say was from 2014, and it is somewhere like saved in one of my emails wherever I'd accessed it. But it just had basically pages and pages where people were expected to come plug in with, if you know a specific language, to then translate it into that language. And I think this one was focused on a lot of South Asian languages, but I want to say that this was in 2014 and around the police murder of Mike Brown. And so you had just pages on pages of direct translations from, English to Malayalam to Tamil to Telugu to Gujarati to Hindi, and so many ones, but the material wasn't changing one by one. And so what does it mean to just translate it into the different languages? But when a lot of these are very different histories, and so if you're going to have something translated, if whoever the recipient is, there might be a different, way to get to the same point. And then I'm thinking about the fact that at the end of the day, it's a point and not really a conversation, right? Like, so much of this is about starting conversations, and giving a relative a letter in a language that they might be more comfortable with might either mean that the person who's giving that letter is not comfortable to continue this conversation in a shared frame of language, but it also might mean that it's just the letter. And at that point, it's not even starting that conversation around education or having that, here's where we're coming from, to try to understand how we can shift where an older, or, that relative is. But it doesn't even necessarily always allow for a conversation to come from that letter. And so at the end of the day, like, what is it exactly doing? What is exactly its point?
This might be a good time to ask one of the questions that I've been most interested in that I brought up last time. A couple of things. One, when we talked about the notion of Asian Americanness, all of you immediately started talking about the different dimensions and aspects of it and the tensions in it. And so I wanted to know two things. One, in relation to letters, which is for each of you guys, how do you see letters like that working in your community? Do you think it's going to lead to people like being more likely to vote for certain things? Do you think it's going to be people to support causes? Do you think it'll help them support you in particular, which are all can be viable things, or something else I'm not thinking about, which I think is great. And I also want to know within your different communities or communities that you can see or are part of, where do you see like where do you envision like realistic linkages between Black communities or Indigenous, or I mean, we start with Black because that's just the topic of this conversation, but Black communities and the communities that you're a part of, or 'cause I know that different communities would have different relations or different opportunities.
I haven't been able to flex the muscle of synthesizing these conversations or even just like having these conversations. So these questions aren't even asked of me. I'm usually the one trying to initiate these with my peers who are usually Southeast Asian, who come from backgrounds who are more lower class, working class. So to be concrete, I'm a part of these two Facebook groups. One is called Asian Americans for Black Power. The other one's called the Vietnamese Solidarity and Action Network. Both of them started up at the same time around the beginning of June, but they came from wildly different levels of preparation. The VSAN, which I'll abbreviate, the Vietnamese Solidarity Action Network, came from a network of people who have many years in doing organizing work, and they had a lot of preparation going into making this group, whereas the AA4BP was created by some students at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities who wanted to just talk to their own peers about this. It started off being called Yellow Peril Supports Black Power, that banner slogan from the 60s, right, where you see these East Asian folks who are holding signs talking about Yellow Tiger supporting Black Panthers. And because of that broad historical moment being captured in the titling of this group, people were like, oh yeah, I recognize that. I see the signaling happening there, and I want to align myself with those values. And so all these people started flooding in just the AA4BP group. However, the people in that group versus the VSAN group were a lot of students who have some sense of what social justice is, or racial justice as a broad category. But in terms of what they talked about, it was in the vein of Letters for Black Lives, in the sense of, my parents have these racist, these bigoted postures. They said some racist things, and I don't know how to talk to them about that. Will you help me? Other Southeast Asian people who probably are in the same boat. Not that there haven't been good conversations, but after a month and a half, the solutions have plateaued. It hasn't moved beyond talking about supporting Blackness in this nebulous way. Yeah, with the VSAN group, they do a lot of the translating work for Vietnamese people specifically. Like, I think the benefit of this ethnically specific group is that people can speak to the more nuanced tensions within that is intra to the ethnicities. And there are multiple ethnicities. There's the Kin, which is like the majority, and then there's like the Montagnards. I'm only starting to learn about these minority ethnicities in Vietnam and learning about Southeast Asian history, and seeing the value of folks from their own affinity group, whether that's ethnic or ethnic gendered, otherwise being able to talk to each other in more granular detail rather than like this broad umbrella of like Asians for Black Power, which ends up being unwieldy.
To answer kind of the more specific question about the letters, I've seen it circling around, but personally, I haven't really heard a lot of stories of the conversations that actually can come from those letters. And that's what worries me or makes me feel some type of way, is that the translation and the sharing of the letters happen within groups of Asian Americans who are already progressive. And that's where it lends itself to, maybe it's an inner group signaling of like, you know, we are more progressive than other Asian Americans. You know, there's this huge Facebook group, Subtle Asian Traits, and it's been kind of covered a little bit, and very interesting politics in that. Then there's like subgroups of that I've seen that are like progressive subtle Asian traits, or like subtle Asian mental health groups, you know, that are more progressive, so to speak. In kind of interesting ways, I also see that the splintering of this very large group into smaller groups is also an attempt to like distance oneself from the larger group, and to say like, I'm not of the politics of everyone in this large subtle Asian traits group. And maybe in some ways I see that the letters and some of that a signaling away from, you know, we're not part of the more conservative elements of our community. We don't own that. I mean, we saw that with, you know, the killing of George Floyd as well. And in the same website, I think, Time to Say Goodbye, there was also another article about this idea of distancing oneself from the Asian officer at the scene, and how that can be problematic in its own way, because it's kind of saying we don't own this member of our community because they're acting as part of the police state, or they're not having the same politics as we do. I think now is the time that's right for this. My hope is that within those Instagram posts and people posting those letters, that people can actually get more involved with local community organizing. Because, and this is maybe, Tree, what you were talking about, the difference between the two groups, because I'm just moved to Connecticut. Before I moved to Connecticut, I was in Boston. I was a community organizer, and I was very involved in Chinese Progressive Association there, which did a lot of work around tenant rights, and especially diminishing properties of Chinatown. Also, Viet Aid, which is based in Dorchester, which is a neighborhood of Boston, was also working. And so a lot of Asian American organizing on the ground in Boston was around tenant rights. And there was a lot of solidarity among Asian American organizers, and African American organizers and Latinx organizers, because rising rent is something that impacts everyone in Boston. And there's a lot of overlap. And there's a lot of, and there was a lot of working class white folks who were also involved in that. And so it was a very multiracial, multi-generational coalition that formed. That is still currently fighting for more access. What I find kind of interesting is Boston City Council, Boston mayoral race are held all by Democrats. Democrats also hold both the House and the Senate in their state legislature. And yet, it's a multi-year fight, and very, very basic tenant rights take years. And then by the time they're passed, they're not even that pertinent to the current issues. Anyway, that's a larger conversation about disillusionment with electoral politics, but this tension between what is happening online and what is being shared online versus what's happening in, those issues around tenant rights or healthcare or public transportation being a big one. Those are the three big ones that a lot of organizing is around. My hope is that the energy that we can see online can be translated in person, which then, it's kind of an interesting moment now with both the energy for organizing, but also with COVID, because my advice to people would be go to a community meeting. There's a lot of community meetings. Go to a march, go to the State House. The State House is not even open for people to go in right now. But I just got an email from one of my old organizers' friends. They're doing an online phone orientation to organize around the next phase of tenant right organizing. So obviously there's still a lot that's happening, but yeah, I think that's my hope, and kind of to answer your question, Darian, too.
Yeah, I'm thinking immediately about something that Jeff Agee, who was a guest on our first episode of this Beyond Allyship series, had pointed out, and I found myself at first feeling like, oh, this is such a pessimistic statement, and then I found myself thinking about like the context that we're all living in and realizing, oh, this is actually quite realist, and I may be adopting this dated mentality myself, thinking about, whether or not folks actually went out to protest or folks actually left their homes to go do something just because we're living in the context of COVID. Whether any of those people would have done that if they hadn't had as flexible of a 9-to-5 workday as they might have with a work from home circumstance. And, whether or not that means that, especially thinking about folks who are setting themselves up as allies, would in that alternate reality have ever set themselves up that way. I find it like less concerning for me generally when I'm thinking about, like, is a white person, going out and protesting or not to be the question that I'm asking myself. I'm asking non-Black POC, would they still have left their house to go out and protest or to go and take these actions had they not been in this particular COVID context, had it not been convenient and easy to do so? Just to go back to your question, Darian, I have never known anyone personally who has used any of those letters. I have never used one of those letters. Nobody I know personally has used one. So I've never been able to ask if it worked. But I think that's also what makes me doubtful. And I think that falls in, Lily, with kind of what you're saying, that like probably the people who need to be having these conversations may not be the people who are touting the letter. They may be that the folks who are writing the letter are not even the ones using it. I've seen it like posted in Facebook groups. I've seen links like passed through mass emails, but I don't actually know if they've ever come to utility.
Seems like why that author wrote that essay then that we're referencing. It's very clear now. These are all great responses, but Asha, what you were saying and with that the person you had on before, it brings up this important notion that politics is linked a lot to economics. I get what you're saying. It's a little too pessimistic, but it's realist in a certain sense. On the one hand, it's kind of deflating a sense of like, wow, there's a moment. But I think there was realness in that moment. But I think there's also an aspect that our economic structure is designed such that politics is not really a part of that. Democracy is a lot of work. You have to know a lot about a lot of issues and give a lot of your time. And we have not decided to invest the spoils of our empire, even in our political institutions, so that we have lots of time to be able to research issues and be active and involved. So I think it does reveal the opportunities that we're witnessing are able when we don't have to work so much.
I love that quote, democracy is a lot of work. I might, embroider it and give it to you as a gift one day, Darian.
Hey.
Yeah, I really, really resonate with that. That's like the number one thing that I learned from my work as a community organizer. Not just that it's a lot of work, but it's a lot of boring and unglamorous and emotionally difficult work. Because I think, and this goes back to the moment thing, is that it can be really exhilarating and exciting to be part of a moment. Even the young people that I was talking to last week were telling me of the joy and the solidarity that they felt marching. And I was so happy for them, and I wasn't about to take the wind out of the sails of an 11-year-old who went on a march in her neighborhood.
I appreciate you, Lily. It's very kind.
Yeah, I was like, life will get you later, but I won't right now.
I take back what I said.
But I think, one thing I kind of want to, maybe this takes the conversation in a different direction, but I think it's something that, we are all pretty interested in, is the idea of what does it mean that because being anti-racist or being anti-white supremacist or combating anti-Blackness has more cultural cachet now, it has more mainstream recognition. It makes me reflect upon what does it mean to kind of industrialize the work of combating racism. So I think we talked about this a bit before, and in our chat about, the nonprofit industrial complex, which is a large word, but really I think what it means is that, and what I understand of the history is that there were a lot of very radical movements that were happening in the United States in the mid 20th century. A lot of Black power movements, feminist conscious raising movements, even socialism and Marxist organizing happening in the United States. And through very deliberate actions from the federal government, through infiltration, a lot of those movements were severely compromised. And I think that this is my understanding of the history of it, is that through that deliberate attacks, some of those movements then sought to gain legitimacy through nonprofit status, through becoming an organization with a board of directors, with a 501c3 tax filing, or C4 if you're feeling very spicy. C3 is, your political organization, but you're not allowed to directly engage in legislative lobbying, like telling people who to vote for. And then C4 is, if you do want to tell your members who to vote for, things like that. I was with the nonprofit and through the process of turning from a C3 to C4. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I think that because certain movements or organizations became more quote unquote legitimate in the eyes of the federal government, yes, it protected them from that level of attack and infiltration, but that also means that a lot of the money that they have come from large foundations, and that money comes with strings. And so when people talk about the nonprofit industrial complex, it's talking about the whole process of what does it mean to become legitimate in the eyes of the federal government? What does it mean to have a tax filing status? What does it mean to get your money from large foundations, which, to be honest, most of those large foundations get a significant chunk of their money from corporations that are causing the harm in the first place. And it becomes this cycle. And so the work that these nonprofits do then are shaped by how are we going to get the next grant, to pay our workers, to provide them health insurance. It's not a nefarious plot. It's just like, how do we continue feeding ourselves and our employees? And I think that this new or new-ish thing of like anti-racism training, it's not that new. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but I think in particularly this moment it becomes salient. And then another thing that I'm reflecting on specifically to do with Asian and Black solidarity is this idea of people of color being a word, being a term, being an identity, so to speak, because a lot of the nonprofit work, this industrialization of anti-racism, I think that this whole idea of like people of color feeds into it so much as it started off as solidarity between different racial groups. But what I've seen that has happened with this name, with this identity, is it actually diminishes the differences within different communities of color. I think that at least for me personally, as someone who's East Asian, who's light-skinned, who went to a very well-known and prestigious university is, I've witnessed how a lot of white organizations want to hire me for their racism training work. They see me as someone perhaps more palatable or more safe. And that's really troubling. But the other thing I will say is, what's very interesting to me is when I go into those organizations and I don't act in the way they thought I was going to act. If I become more vocal about, hey, we need to not just be talking about racism in our organization, but really, if we're talking about that, we need to put our money where our mouth is. We need to be talking about police brutality against Black folks. We need to be talking about specific issues, not just a nebulous anti-racism work. Then the way that I get treated becomes a lot more aggressive and becomes a lot less safe for them to interact with me. And I think that's also shown me that, these identities that we hold and how we're treated and how other people see us can be very fluid in some ways.
Lily, something that you were saying that I think stands out, and I know, Tree, you had mentioned the corporatization of white fragility by Robin DiAngelo as part of that conversation. There's the statistic, and I'm trying to locate it as we're speaking, that, folks of color, as they enter workplaces and as they tend to be the folks who are experiencing and noticing and reacting to racial discrimination within those corporate spaces, what will happen to, and I want to say person of color because I don't remember if it's broken down by racial identity, but that those folks will suffer from a lack of promotions, or there'll be a significant negative effect, right, on their future within that workplace. But then there's the other side of that coin, which is when white folks do that type of work, when they speak up, when they notice, they are more likely to be promoted, to get the bonus. There's a significant positive effect on their experience within that workplace. And I think it comes out, I'm going to locate the study, but I think it comes out with that significant statistical effect being able to be quantified, is able to be seen in terms of capital and then promotion upwards, which is just kind of an addition to that conversation in terms of what it means to be palatable, what it means if somebody is on paper, maybe what that corporation wants. At the end of the day, the moment a person of color opens their mouth to speak about what is going on, they face immediately those negative statistical effects.
Yeah, this is a great discussion about the notion of people of color and how that relates to the differences and among the groups. When you're talking about the fact that because of your East Asian, your light skin, and there's a lot more comfort that white people have with that, my first reaction was like, from a strategical point, that doesn't really bother me that much, right? That's white people have, but that's something that you guys might have issue with. But I'm saying, like, if we're building a movement together, I think it might be more effective if white people like East Asian people, then we can figure out how to get you guys in those spaces, and you can do the kind of disruption or resource siphoning or influence and education that might be useful. I think that is different than the goal of getting more South Asian or Southeast Asian people into those spaces to do that work. And I'm not entirely sure. And when it comes to the question of transforming our racial configuration or helping Black people or helping Asian Americans, I'm not exactly sure how those two things link. One seems like it's effective, we can use different ways. The other seems like it can have its own issues, its own benefits, but the one of trying to get a more wide variety of Asian Americans into these positions, to me, seems much more in this kind of liberal framework that is being critiqued. Though I do understand that there are real financial outcomes to that, that's just how I see it. I also that relates to the notion of people of color, which does obscure the differences within groups, but it does seem like there's a common experience of relation to whiteness that is the focal point of that identity. But it may not be good enough, right? This is why there are some people who are like, this is why we just be about class anyway. This is not going to work. There's too much variety in between these groups of people. But I also think it seems like there is space for us to come together with an angle of how we're going to try to deal with white supremacy, how we're going to try to deal with the racial caste system that we're in, maybe simultaneously other spaces for more linkages within the groups. But that's why I asked the question, because I do think that exploration is important, and this is why I asked the question that for you guys, what kinds of groups among that would be more likely to be involved in a multiracial solidarity project, right? I know there are different class levels and caste systems and ethnicities and things like that. That might be a way that we could break apart the people of color and just focus on who are some of these groups or people or organizations that actually would be worth reaching out to. And maybe we shouldn't just, as a Black person, maybe I shouldn't just go try to talk to people who are Asian American or part of an Asian American progressive association. Maybe I should try to find particular ethnicities or classes or groups of people within Asian American identity moniker that might be more fruitful.
I'm curious about that question, Darian. I'm thinking immediately about movements that exist in parallel to the movement for Black liberation within the US. And that feels like a fruitful place to begin, because obviously when movements are already in parallel or at least have hands reaching out to one another, that can almost always lead to a more fruitful conversation because folks are already within the same plane of conversation. For me, thinking about the caste abolition movement, folks who like thinking about, Dalit Panthers, thinking about the connection to the American Black liberation movement, thinking about letters back and forth, those seem like immediately places to start. If it's like, okay, what group within the larger political identifying group do you start having those conversations with? But then I think there's also the other side in my mind, that is those folks are already having these conversations and may already be doing this work and this labor and like would have made those connections immediately. Just to take Equality Labs or ASADA as like immediate examples that have been doing work within these spaces, those are already clear that those efforts are already being made or were being made even before this current context that we're in, right? Before the murder of George Floyd, those synergies already existed. And now I'm speaking, right, as a non-Black POC, the question is about who has the least amount of education in this space. And it's not going to be the people, obviously, who have been doing that labor. And that's where I see, as a person of my privileges, oh, this is the conversation I have to place on my back, right? Like this has to be on my shoulders, because without any education, there's no way to get folks who are not already part of a movement to join the movement. That's kind of where my head goes first.
Yeah, thank you for that, Asha and Darian. I'm going to pull back to what you said at the start, Asha, of like you hubbing with your circles around anti-ICE and anti-deportation type movements, and correct me if I'm wrong, and add on as you need. And those are inroads for people to move and sustain enthusiasm or fire that keeps them in some kind of lane, a lane of movement within the broader storm of movements.
One thing I was thinking about in particular was this moment of the third world solidarity that I don't think is as common now. It's a topic I'm very interested in, and I'm interested in educating myself further on, because I think there is something different about that phrasing, third world solidarity, than, say, POC solidarity. Because I think, one, it highlights colonialism as front and center in some ways. It also highlights, I think, class and wealth. But I mean, obviously, there's a variety of racial dynamics associated with it. Darian, you were talking about class in particular. And that's something I think about a lot, especially, obviously, within the Asian American community. So, for example, I come from a background where my family is Han Chinese, which is the ethnic majority in China. I always preface it by saying class is a bit complicated when you talk about it generationally. If you come from China, quote unquote, mainland China, or non-Hong Kong, and not the folks who went to Taiwan and have their own governing system and their own country, this idea of generational wealth, generational class is totally different in a context when you had a cultural revolution and you had class struggle and you had an overturning of things. On the other hand, after Mao passed and Deng Xiaoping came to power, China now today is not a communist utopia by any means. And I have always observed to people, because I grew up in Shanghai, that I think Shanghai is the most capitalistic place I've ever been to in my life, including New York City. I think there's a lot of different reasons. But where I was going with this is that I've been thinking a lot about, Darian, your question of like, should I just go talk to all the Asians, or like, are there specific people? How does class play into it? My family comes from an ethnic majority. My parents are very much invested in the project of starting generational wealth. They view that as a way to gain more legitimacy within the United States. And I think that they understand, and I see a lot of wealthy Chinese Americans who see education in certain higher education institutions as part of this cultural capital. They now begun to be awakened to the fact that actually just having money is one thing, but having political power is a different thing. And so I see a lot of that kind of organizing that's happening among very wealthy Chinese Americans, Han Chinese Americans. And what I find very interesting about that kind of awareness is that the lines of Democrat and Republican are much less staunchly firm. In fact, I've seen a lot of, oh, donate to Asian candidates. To them, it's like, oh, you're Democrat, you're Republican, oh, you're Chinese American. Basically, mostly Chinese American. I want to donate to you because seeing more Chinese Americans in elected office will give us more cultural power. But I've seen that a lot of those candidates have vastly different platforms. Some of when I wanted to run for political office at one point in my life, and a lot of my parents' friends are like, oh yeah, we'll donate to you like all this money. And you've even asked me what my platform is. Like, do you understand that I will be taxing you a lot more? The frameworks of liberalism and conservatism don't perfectly mesh into the different communities that we're a part of. I think we have to reimagine even that political spectrum, so to speak. From my conversations with many of my Latinx friends, there's a very similar dynamic as well. This spectrum it's not so clear and it's not so linear. I'm starting to think about it, so I don't have any great conclusions. It excites me and it makes me curious because I think that that's a new and exciting path. What does these racial identities mean? What does conservatism and liberalism mean? Because I think that the old definitions of those don't work. We've seen that those old models of political identification at the end of the day served similar powers of wealth and of empire. And so I'm excited to see what happens next.
Yeah, and that's basically why I asked the question. It wasn't even so much that I wanted specific answers because I was like, yeah, tell me. No, not like that. But just I think this discussion itself is very fruitful and useful for the people that will be listening, me myself included, to know what you guys think about this. Maybe there is a class dynamic that might be a problem with the Han Chinese community, right? Where they're looking for cultural power. They believe that if they get you in there, you're enough like them that when it really matters, there's a few votes that really matter. You'll be on their side, and they're fine with more taxes. If the thing they really care about, you'll do. It's been great to hear you guys talk about these things. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for this great conversation. We'll have more coming from Darian and Lily in the coming weeks, as well as conversations with campaign managers at 18 Million Rising and Empower Change, the executive directors at Freedom Inc., and more. How can we educate ourselves on anti-Blackness in our communities? How can we unpack internalized oppression and internalized supremacy? These questions and more on this series, Moving Beyond Allyship. We're excited to keep doing this work with you.